Greetings, warriors and dreamers. Welcome to the realms of sleep, where tonight we journey through the epic world of God of War. I am your guide through the 9 realms, where ancient gods whisper their secrets and mythic landscapes unfold before us. From the frost-covered mountains of Midgard to the golden halls of Asgard, these tales of gods and giants will carry you into peaceful slumber. Lay down your weapons, rest your weary head, and allow the legends of these powerful beings to become the landscape of your dreams. The battles have been fought, and now is the time for rest. So close your eyes, brave one. Let the fire of the hearth warm you as we begin our journey through realms both wondrous and dangerous. The heat of Muspelheim wrapped around Kratos like a memory, not the suffocating intensity that most travelers described when speaking of the realm of fire, but something gentler, a lingering warmth that reminded him of nights spent beside forge fires in his distant past. The air shimmered before him, distorting the vast landscape of volcanic rock and distant, slow-moving rivers of molten earth that carved their unhurried paths through the terrain. "Boy," he called, his deep voice carrying across the stillness. "Stay close." Atreus moved to his father's side, bow slung across his back, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. The boy had grown since their first journey together, not just in height but in wisdom and understanding. His gaze took in the unusual calm of this region of Muspelheim, with the keen observation that Kratos had come to respect. "It's different here," Atreus noted, his voice hushed as if reluctant to disturb the quiet. "Not like the trials we faced before. The heat feels patient." Kratos nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of his son's perception. Most of Muspelheim roared with violent fire, endless combat, and challenges designed to test warriors to their limits. But they had deliberately sought out this forgotten canyon, far from the arena where Surta's champions clashed in eternal competition. This place was not made for war, Kratos said, moving forward along a natural path that wound between towering formations of obsidian and cooling magma. It was made for creation. From the bag at Kratos' side came a familiar voice, the severed head of Mimir, advisor and self-proclaimed smartest man alive, though no longer attached to a body. "The old man's right, little brother," Mimir chimed in, his accent as thick as ever despite the magical bindings that kept him conscious. "We're approaching what was once the most renowned smithy in all the 9 realms. The Forge of Surta's Dawn, they called it, where the fire giants crafted their finest works long before they turned their talents exclusively to weapons of war." Atreus quickened his pace to walk alongside his father. "Is that why we're here? To find a weapon?" Kratos' expression remained impassive, but something subtle shifted in his eyes, a softening that only his son might notice. "No, we are here to learn. There is power in creation that surpasses destruction. This is a lesson I would have you understand." The path widened as they descended deeper into the canyon. Above them, the sky of Muspelheim glowed with its perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something between, a canvas of deep amber and muted crimson. No stars penetrated this shroud, yet the landscape was never truly dark, illuminated by the realm's inner fire that pulsed like a living heartbeat beneath the surface of the world. "According to the scrolls we found in Tyr's vault," Mimir continued, "the smiths of this forge developed a technique for binding metals that didn't require the raging furnaces typically needed in Muspelheim. They called it the Whisper of Embers. a method that used patience and precision rather than overwhelming heat. A quiet flame, Kratos remarked, almost to himself. Aye, precisely that, Mimir agreed. And if the legends are true, items crafted with this method possess unique properties. Flexibility without brittleness, strength without weight. The perfect balance that usually requires sacrificing one quality for another. Atreus looked up at his father with newfound understanding. And that's what we need, to strengthen my bow without making it too heavy to draw quickly. Kratos nodded once, the gesture containing both confirmation and approval of his son's reasoning. The boy's hunting bow, while well crafted, had limitations that became more apparent as Atreus grew stronger and their journeys took them into increasingly dangerous territories. A bow reinforced with the techniques of Muspelheim's master smiths would serve him better against the challenges that undoubtedly lay ahead. The canyon narrowed suddenly, then opened into a vast circular chamber that nature could never have formed on its own. Smooth walls of volcanic rock rose in a perfect dome, their surface etched with ancient runes and elaborate designs that told stories of creation rather than conquest. At the chamber's center stood what remained of the legendary forge, a circular platform of carved stone surrounding a central pit where fires would once have blazed. Now only faint embers glowed among the ashes, their light barely visible in the ambient illumination of the realm. Workbenches carved from stone lined the perimeter, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use. Tools hung from pegs or lay abandoned where they had last been set down. Hammers, tongs, punches, and specialized implements whose purposes were no longer obvious. Silence hung heavy in the air, the kind of deep quiet that accumulates over centuries of abandonment. Not even the omnipresent rumble of Muspelheim's subterranean fires penetrated this sanctuary. It appears we are not too late, Kratos observed, approaching the central forge with measured steps. The embers still burn, barely, Atreus noted, peering into the pit with undisguised fascination. How can we work with so little fire? Kratos set down his axe and the bag containing Mimir, positioning the head on a flat stone where he could observe their efforts. That is what we have come to learn. The scrolls spoke of the technique, but not its details. We must discover those ourselves. Mimir cleared his throat, a habit retained from when he had possessed a body. I'd suggest starting with the surroundings, brothers. The fire giants were practical sorts for all their mystical reputation. They would have left instructions for apprentices. Taking this advice, father and son began a methodical examination of the forge chamber. Atreus, with his gift for languages, focused on the runes that covered the walls, running his fingers over the ancient carvings and muttering translations under his breath. Kratos inspected the tools and the structure of the forge itself, his experienced eye recognizing the purpose of specialized implements that would be unfamiliar to most. Time passed without urgency as they worked. In this forgotten corner of Muspelheim, the pressure of their greater journey seemed temporarily suspended, replaced by the simple focus of craftsmen engaged in their work. It was a rare moment of peace for both, particularly for Kratos, whose life had been dominated by violence and vengeance for so long that quieter pursuits felt almost foreign to him. "Father," Atreus called eventually, excitement coloring his voice. "I think I've found something." Kratos joined his son at a section of wall where the runes formed a dense cluster around a circular carving. Unlike the flowing narrative patterns of the other inscriptions, this section appeared to be instructional, with diagrams interspersed among the text. "It speaks of the forge's heart," Atreus translated, his finger tracing the symbols as he read. "The fire that needs no tending, the flame that sleeps but never dies." He frowned slightly in concentration. There's something about breath beneath the ashes and the sleeping giant's dreams. Metaphorical language, Mimir commented from his perch. Common in technical inscriptions of that period. The fire giants believed that understanding required both technical knowledge and poetic intuition. Kratos studied the diagrams, recognition dawning in his eyes. These are air channels, he said, pointing to a series of lines that ran beneath the depicted forge, not to feed flame, but to preserve embers. Moving back to the central pit, Kratos knelt and began carefully brushing away layers of ash, revealing a pattern of small holes in the stone base. The forge breathes, he explained to Atreus, who watched with intent curiosity. These openings connect to chambers below that control the flow of air. Too much and the embers would flare and consume themselves. Too little and they would die. Like the bellows of a normal forge, but more subtle, Atreus suggested. Yes, Kratos confirmed. The master smiths of Muspelheim understood that the greatest heat is not always the most useful. Sometimes it is the patient ember that creates the strongest bond. As Kratos continued clearing ash, his fingers encountered a series of stone discs set into the forge floor. Each could be rotated to align different patterns of holes, precisely controlling the breath of the forge. It was an elegant system, designed with a sophistication that spoke of centuries of refinement. I believe, Mimir offered, that you've found the heart of the Whisper of Embers technique, not maximizing heat, but optimizing it, creating the perfect temperature for specific alloys without wasting energy or material. Kratos nodded, his respect for the forgotten crafters growing. Such precision required patience and understanding, qualities often overlooked by those who sought only power. He found himself wondering what his life might have been like had he discovered such pursuits before the gods of Olympus had set him on his path of destruction. Father, Atreus' voice pulled Kratos from his thoughts. What's happening to the light? The ambient glow of Muspelheim was indeed changing, the perpetual twilight deepening toward what might be called evening in this realm, without true day or night. The scrolls they had studied had mentioned this, the fading of light, that marked the closing of the window when the forge's embers could be properly worked. We must hurry, Kratos said, his voice taking on new urgency. Bring your bow and the materials we gathered. As a trio retrieved their supplies, Kratos adjusted the stone discs according to the patterns shown in the wall diagrams. With each alignment, the barely visible embers responded, not flaring into flame, but intensifying their glow, as if acknowledging the return of skilled hands to long-abandoned tools. The metal must be prepared, Kratos instructed, taking the materials from Atus, small pieces of an unusual alloy they had collected from a fallen traveler, combined with traces of ore unique to Muspelheim's veins. Watch closely. This is not like the forging you have seen before. Instead of placing the metal directly in the embers, Kratos arranged it on a stone shelf above the pit, where the heat could reach it indirectly. From a pouch at his belt, he extracted a small vial of liquid, sap, from the world tree Yggdrasil, collected during their travels. The binding agent, he explained, applying drops of the luminescent sap to the metal with precise movements. Heat alone will not create what we seek. The metal must be persuaded, not forced. Atreus watched with rapt attention as his father worked. The boy had seen Kratos fight countless battles with unmatched ferocity, but this careful, patient crafting revealed a different facet of the god of war, one that perhaps had always existed beneath the rage and violence, waiting for the opportunity to emerge. As they worked together, positioning the metal and adjusting the forge's breath, something unexpected occurred. A wisp of luminescence rose from the embers, not smoke or flame, but something more deliberate in its movement. It coiled in the air above the forge, gradually taking a vaguely humanoid shape that hovered before them. "We have company, brothers," Mimir announced unnecessarily, his tone careful rather than alarmed. The luminous figure seemed to study them, its form constantly shifting like smoke caught in gentle currents. When it spoke, the voice was neither male nor female, carrying the crackling undertone of fire, yet soft as whispered secrets. "Visitors to the Forgotten Forge," it observed. "Not fire giants, yet you work our metals with knowing hands." Kratos reached instinctively for his axe before stopping himself. This was not a threat, at least not yet, and they were guests in this ancient place of creation. "We seek knowledge," he stated simply. "The whisper of embers." The spectral figure drifted closer, examining their work with evident interest. "Many have sought our secrets, warrior. Most desire only to forge weapons of greater destruction. What do you intend to create?" Before Kratos could answer, Atreus stepped forward. "A better bow," he said honestly, "but not just for killing, for hunting, for protection." He paused, finding his words carefully. "For balance." The luminous entity seemed to consider this, its form rippling with what might have been amusement or approval. Balance. Yes, that was always the true purpose of our craft, before war consumed all things. It hovered over the forge, observing their arrangement of the materials. "Your approach is interesting, unorthodox yet respectful of the fundamental principles. Will you help us?" Atreus asked directly, earning a subtle nod of approval from his father for his straightforwardness. The spirit drifted in contemplative circles before responding. "I am bound to this forge until its final ember fades. I was once master here, now neither living nor dead, but memory given form by the magic inherent in this place." A pause, during which the luminescence brightened slightly. "Yes, I will guide your hands, but know that the creation belongs to the Creator. I can show the path, but you must walk it yourselves." "That is how it should be," Kratos agreed solemnly. Under the spirit's guidance, they began to adjust their technique. The ghostly smith directed subtle changes to the positioning of the metal, the timing of exposure to the ember's glow, the application of the binding agent. Each instruction was offered not as a command, but as shared wisdom, the passing of knowledge from one craftsman to another across the divide of time, race, and even life itself. "The mistake many made," the spirit explained as they worked, "was believing that metal must be conquered through force. In truth, it must be understood. Each alloy has a voice, a nature. Force it to be what it is not, and it will fail when most needed. Encourage its true potential, and it will serve faithfully." Atreus nodded, absorbing these lessons with the same intensity he applied to learning new languages or hunting techniques. "Like people," he observed quietly. The spirit's glow pulsed brighter for a moment. "Wisdom from a young voice. Yes, very much like people." As they continued their work, Muspelheim's twilight deepened further, the ambient light fading toward what passed for night in this realm. The embers in the forge, however, seemed to brighten in response, as if drawing strength from the growing darkness. "The metal is ready," the spirit announced eventually. "Now comes the binding, the heart of our technique. Warrior, you have worked metal before. What would you do next?" Kratos considered the traditional methods he knew from his original homeland. "Normally, I would hammer the pieces together while hot, forcing them to join through pressure and heat. And that is where most smiths end their understanding, the spirit agreed. But observe. It directed their attention to how the prepared metal now glowed with an inner light that matched the embers below. When properly aligned with the forge's breath, metal develops a sympathy with its joining piece. It does not require force, merely guidance. Under the spirit's instruction, Kratos and Etris carefully brought the metal components together, not hammering them but pressing them with firm, steady pressure, using tools that distributed the force evenly. As the pieces made contact, something remarkable occurred. They seemed to sigh into one another, the boundaries between them blurring, not through melting but through a more fundamental harmony. The whisper of embers speaks to the very essence of the material, the spirit explained, its voice taking on a teacher's passion, heat enough to awaken the metal's voice, but not so much that it screams, pressure enough to suggest the joining, but not so much that it is commanded. Petrus watched in wonder as the separate pieces became one, the seam between them disappearing, not through brute fusion, but through what almost appeared to be mutual agreement. It's like they want to be together, he marveled. All things contain the potential for harmony, the spirit observed. Even metal, even gods. This last was said with a meaningful glow directed toward Kratos, who acknowledged the insight with a slight inclination of his head. For hours they worked as the light continued to fade, applying the whisper of embers technique to reinforce Atreya's bow without adding significant weight. The spirit guided them through each step, sometimes directing with words, other times simply adjusting their hands with gentle touches that felt like warm breezes. During quiet moments in the process, the spirit shared fragments of history, tales of the forge's glory days when fire giants created works of both utility and beauty, when crafting was celebrated as the highest expression of Muspelheim's power rather than warfare. These stories carried no obvious moral or lesson, but painted a picture of a culture that had once valued creation over destruction, a past that had been largely forgotten in the realm's long, violent history. Many believe that fire exists only to consume, the spirit mused as they allowed one section of the bow to cool slowly in a bed of ashes. They forget that without fire there would be no hearth to gather around, no metals shaped into tools, no warmth in the cold darkness. Fire destroys, yes, but it also enables creation. The difference lies in how it is directed, in the intention behind its use. Kratos, working with careful precision on a delicate join, found himself reflecting on these words. Fire had been a constant in his life, the fires that had forged his chains as the ghost of Sparta, the fires he had brought to Olympus in his rage, the pyre he had built for his wife in the northern lands. Always, fire had been associated with endings, with death and destruction. The idea of fire as a creative force, as the beginning rather than the conclusion, struck him with unexpected resonance. As Muspelheim's twilight reached its deepest point, they completed the final reinforcements to the bow. The weapon now bore subtle patterns along its length where the new material had been integrated, not as obvious additions, but as harmonious extensions of the original design. When Atreus tested its draw, the increased strength was immediately apparent, yet the bow responded as swiftly as ever to his touch. "It feels alive," he commented, running his fingers along the smooth surface. "Like it's responding to me, not just being used by me." The spirit hovered nearby, its glow dimmed but satisfied. That is the mark of a successful binding. The materials remain true to themselves while becoming something greater together. The best crafting honors what exists while revealing what could be. As Atreus continued to test the bow's balance and feel, Kratos approached the spectral smith, speaking quietly. "This knowledge you have shared, it was not meant to be lost." "No," the spirit agreed, its form flickering slightly as Muspelheim's natural illumination began to gradually return, signaling the approaching end of the realm's brief night cycle. "But all realms turn toward war eventually. Creation is patient, gradual. Destruction is immediate, impressive. The latter easily overshadows the former in times of conflict." "I know this truth too well," Kratos acknowledged, thinking of his own path from Spartan general to vengeful god to his current journey of fatherhood and reluctant wisdom. How much easier it had been to destroy than to build, to end rather than begin. "Perhaps that is why you were guided here," the spirit suggested. "One who has wielded destruction so completely might best understand the value of creation's subtler power." Before Kratos could respond, Atreus joined them, cradling his transformed bow with evident pride and gratitude. "Thank you," he said to the spirit with simple sincerity. "Not just for helping with the bow, but for the stories and lessons too." The ghost of the master smith seemed to brighten at the boy's words. "It has been heartening to share knowledge again after so long in silence, to see young hands learn old wisdom." The luminous form began to fade slightly as the ambient light of Muspelheim strengthened with the realm's returning day cycle. "I cannot leave this place, but what I have taught you can. The whisper of embers deserves to live beyond these walls." Kratos nodded solemnly. "It will. The boy has learned well, and I—" He paused, finding words that did not come easily to him. "I am reminded of things long forgotten. The creation of a single item is worthwhile," the spirit said, its voice growing fainter. "The creation of an understanding that continues beyond yourself is greater still." Its form had diminished to little more than a suggestion of light now. "I return to the embers until the next seekers arrive, be it tomorrow or another 1,000 years." "Wait," a truce called as the spirit continued to fade. "You never told us your name." A ripple of what might have been laughter moved through the diminishing light. "Names were less important to us than deeds, but if you wish to remember me by one, I was called Eldred, which in the old tongue meant fire's wisdom." "Eldred," Atreus repeated, committing it to memory. "We'll remember. And perhaps," the spirit's voice came now as if from a great distance, though it still hovered before them, "you will return someday with your own wisdom to share." With those words, the ghostly presence dissolved completely, returning to whatever state of not quite existence it had occupied before their arrival. The forge chamber felt emptier for its absence, yet somehow still inhabited by the knowledge and history they had shared. Mimir, who had observed the entire process in uncharacteristic silence, finally spoke up. "Well now, that was a proper education. Not often you get smithing lessons from one of the legendary masters themselves." Kratos carefully extinguished their work area, ensuring no accidental fires would spread in their absence. "The bow will serve you well," he told Atreus, "but the knowledge of how it was made is the greater gift." Atreus nodded, understanding his father's meaning. Creating instead of destroying, seeing the potential in things, not just their use. He looked around the ancient forge with new appreciation. "Do you think others will find this place someday? Learn what we learned?" "Perhaps," Kratos replied. "Knowledge has a way of surviving, even when those who held it are gone." He gathered their remaining supplies and lifted Mimir's head, securing it once more at his belt. "We should return. Daylight in Midgard will not wait for us." As they prepared to leave the forge chamber, Atreus paused by the central pit, where the embers still glowed with gentle persistence. "Thank you," he whispered, too quietly for his father to hear. Whether he addressed the embers themselves, the spirit of Eldred, or some more abstract concept of the knowledge they had shared, he couldn't have said precisely. Father and son departed the ancient forge as they had arrived, moving through the canyon in comfortable silence, each absorbed in private reflections on what they had experienced. The quiet between them was not empty, but full, of shared understanding, of mutual respect, of lessons that extended beyond mere craftsmanship to touch on their journey together. As they neared the realm gate that would return them to Midgard, Adris looked back at the canyon that held the forgotten forge, now receding into the perpetual fiery haze of Muspelheim. "We made something good there," he said simply. Kratos placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that once would have felt foreign to him but now came with increasing naturalness. "Yes," he agreed, "we did." The transition between realms always brought its own peculiar sensation. A momentary suspension between worlds, a breath held in the space where realities touched without truly meeting. Kratos had grown accustomed to this feeling, though he doubted he would ever find it entirely natural. For Atreus, born in Midgard but carrying the blood of multiple realms in his veins, the passage seemed less disorienting, almost intuitive. They emerged into the familiar woods near their home, the air damp with recent rain, carrying the rich scent of wet earth and pine that marked the forests of Midgard. After Muspelheim's constant warmth and amber light, the cool green shadows felt like plunging into cold water, shocking at first, then refreshing. "Quite the contrast," Mimir observed as Kratos unhooked the head from his belt, allowing him a better view of their surroundings. From the realm of eternal fire to this soggy wilderness. Though I must say, the change in temperature is rather welcome for those of us without proper circulation. Atreus inhaled deeply, readjusting to the forest air. "It smells like home," he said simply, already scanning their surroundings with the instinctive awareness of a hunter. His hand moved occasionally to touch the transformed bow across his back, as if reassuring himself that their accomplishment in Muspelheim had been real, and not some dream born of the fire realm's strange atmosphere. Kratos surveyed the position of the sun through the breaks in the forest canopy. "We have been away longer than intended. Night will fall soon." "All the more reason to appreciate our newly acquired skills," Mimir commented. "Nothing quite like returning from a successful quest with new knowledge and a tangible improvement to show for it. Quite refreshing compared to the usual barely escaped with our lives outcome that seems to follow you two around." Atreus grinned at this observation. "It is nice not to be running from something angry for once." He looked to his father. "Should we hunt on the way back? We could test the bow." Kratos considered this suggestion. Their food stores at home were sufficient, but fresh meat would be welcome, and the practical application of their work would complete the cycle of learning they had begun. "Yes, but we stay alert. These woods are never truly safe." They set off toward home at an unhurried pace, moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of those who knew its paths intimately. Atreus led slightly, his keen eyes searching for signs of game, while Kratos maintained vigilant awareness of their surroundings, always prepared for unexpected threats. As they walked, Atreus' thoughts returned to their experience in the forge. "Father," he began, his tone thoughtful, "Eldred spoke about fire as something that creates, not just destroys. But in most of the stories we've heard, fire giants are all about destruction. Surtur is supposed to burn the whole world at Ragnarok." "Myths often simplify," Kratos replied. "Peoples are rarely only one thing, though stories may remember them as such. Mimir chimed in from his position at Kratos' belt. The old man's right, little brother. The fire giants were renowned crafters long before they became feared warriors. The shift happened gradually, over centuries of conflict with Asgard. Thor's grandfather, Buri, led some of the first aggressive campaigns into Muspelheim, claiming territories for Asgard. The giants' focus on weaponry came from necessity, not nature. Atreus absorbed this information with his usual curiosity. So, they were forced to become destroyers when they used to be creators. Many paths are chosen for us before we realize there was a choice to be made, Kratos said, his voice carrying the weight of personal understanding. Breaking from that path requires recognizing it first. They walked in contemplative silence for a time, each considering these words in their own way. The forest grew denser around them, ancient pines giving way to more varied vegetation that spoke of proximity to water. Atreus adjusted their course slightly, leading them toward a small stream where game would likely visit in the evening hours. There, he whispered eventually, dropping into a hunter's crouch and pointing toward a clearing ahead. A young deer stood by the stream, its head raised in alert vigilance, unaware yet of their presence. Perfect chance to test the bow. Kratos nodded, moving back to give his son space for the shot. Atreus carefully unshouldered the reinforced bow, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. The weapon responded to his touch with new responsiveness, the draw smoother yet requiring greater strength, a perfect match for the boy's developing abilities. Atreus took a deep breath, sighting along the arrow. The bow felt different in his hands, not just physically improved, but somehow more attuned to his intentions. It reminded him of the spectral smith's words about materials finding harmony together, creating something greater than their separate parts. The arrow flew true, striking the deer with clean precision. The animal collapsed instantly, spared any suffering by the accuracy of the shot. Atreus looked to his father, unable to completely hide his pride in the perfect kill. Kratos acknowledged the achievement with a nod. Well done. The bow serves you as it should. They approached the fallen deer together, Atreus already retrieving his hunting knife to begin the practical work of field dressing their kill. This too was part of what Kratos had taught him, respecting the full cycle of hunting, taking responsibility for each step, from tracking to preparation. As Atreus worked, Kratos surveyed the clearing, his attention caught by something unusual at the stream's edge. He moved closer to investigate, finding a set of distinctive tracks pressed into the mud, too large for common forest creatures, with an arrangement of claws that suggested something not entirely natural. "Father," Atreus called, noticing his distraction. "Draugr have passed through here," Kratos informed him, studying the track's direction. "Recently, moving eastward," Atreus frowned, his hands stilling on their task. "Toward the settlements, there's a small village that way, people who trade with the witch sometimes." "Yes," Kratos confirmed, his expression grave. "Finish quickly. We should follow these tracks." The peaceful return home they had anticipated now shifted into something more urgent. Atreus completed the necessary preparation of their kill with efficient haste, wrapping the meat they would carry and leaving the remainder for the forest's scavengers, a practice that honored the natural cycle. With their hunt concluded, they turned their attention to tracking the Draugr. The undead creatures rarely traveled alone, and their presence so close to human settlements boded ill. Though both Kratos and Atreus had faced such enemies many times before, the threat they posed to ordinary villagers could not be ignored. "Curious timing," Mimir observed as they followed the trail. You return from learning creation's arts only to be immediately called back to destruction's necessity. The world does not change its nature because we visit a forge, Kratos replied, though there was something contemplative in his tone. Threats must still be met. But maybe how we meet them can change, Atreus suggested, moving alongside his father with the newfound bow ready in his hands. Eldred said it's about intention. Fire can destroy or create, depending on how it's directed. Kratos glanced at his son, noting the maturity in his thinking. Yes, purpose matters. Remember that when we find these creatures. The Draugr trail led them through increasingly dense forest before turning toward a ridge that overlooked a small valley. As they crested the rise, they caught sight of their quarry, a group of 7 Draugr shambling through the trees below, moving with single-minded purpose toward what must be the village Atreus had mentioned, though it remained out of sight beyond the next hill. We intercept them here, Kratos decided, assessing the terrain, before they reach open ground where they could spread out. Atreus nodded, already moving to a position that would give him a clear line of sight with his bow. The transformation they had worked on the weapon would now face its first true test in combat, though both father and son carried a new perspective on fighting after their time in the ancient forge. "Remember what we learned," Kratos said quietly as they prepared to engage. "Strength guided by purpose, not merely unleashed." Atreus understood his meaning. Before their visit to Muspelheim, combat had been primarily about survival and victory. Now, added dimension colored their actions. Protection rather than simply destruction. Precision rather than overwhelming force. The first Draugr fell to Atreus' arrow before the creatures even registered the threat, the enhanced bow driving the shaft completely through its target. Kratos followed this opening with calculated movement, entering the group not as the whirlwind of chaos he could become, but as something more deliberate. Each strike of his axe severing a specific threat, each positioning of his body creating strategic advantage. Together, father and son dismantled the Draugr group with an efficiency that seemed almost merciful in its precision. There was no wasted energy. No excessive force, only the necessary actions required to eliminate the threat to the unseen village beyond the ridge. When the last creature fell, neither Kratos nor Atreus felt the usual surge of battle satisfaction. Instead, there was simply the quiet acknowledgement of a necessary task completed well. They stood among the fallen Draugr, breathing steadily, weapons held ready, but no longer required. "That was different," Atreus observed, looking down at his bow. "Not just the weapon, but how it felt to use it." Kratos nodded, understanding precisely what his son meant. Their time in the forge had shifted something subtle but fundamental in their approach, not weakening their effectiveness but refining it, aligning action more perfectly with intention. "The village is safe," he said simply. "That was our purpose." They made certain all the Draugr were truly destroyed, then resumed their journey homeward, carrying both the meat from their hunt and the quiet satisfaction of a threat averted through skillful intervention rather than mere violence. As the familiar outline of their cabin appeared through the trees, the day's last light filtering through branches in golden shafts, Atreus found himself reflecting on how much had changed in what had seemed like a simple quest for weapon improvement. They had sought a technique and found philosophy, looked for strength and discovered balance. "Home at last," Mimir announced cheerfully as they approached the cabin. "And with plenty to show for our efforts, both tangible and otherwise." Kratos set about preparing their dwelling, rekindling the hearth fire that had been carefully banked before their departure. checking the perimeter for any signs of disturbance, establishing the familiar security that allowed them rare moments of peace in this dangerous world. Atreus assisted with practiced ease, their shared routine requiring few words. As he helped prepare the fresh venison for cooking, he looked at the hearth fire with new understanding. The flames that warmed their home and cooked their food were the same element that had forged his bow, destructive or creative depending solely on how they were directed, just as Eldred had taught them. Night settled fully around the cabin, the darkness outside making the glow of their hearth seem all the more precious. Kratos turned the meat on its spit, the fat dripping occasionally into the flames with a satisfying hiss. Kratos sat cross-legged nearby, applying a protective oil to his bow's string, another lesson learned in the ancient forge, where Eldred had emphasized the importance of maintenance. "The bow performed well," Kratos observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "The balance is good," Atreus nodded, running his fingers along the weapon's curve where the new material had been integrated so seamlessly it was difficult to see where original ended and addition began. "It's stronger, but it doesn't feel heavier, just like Eldred said it would be." Their peaceful evening was interrupted by an unexpected sound, a deliberate clearing of a throat outside their cabin door. Instantly alert, Kratos reached for his axe, while Atreus knocked an arrow to his newly reinforced bow. "Rather impressive dwelling you've established," called a voice that matched the throat clearing in its careful politeness. "Quite secure, excellent use of natural defensive positioning." Kratos and Atreus exchanged a quick glance before moving cautiously toward the door, weapons ready but not yet committed to hostile action. What they found was not at all what they had expected. A figure stood before their home, tall, lean, with skin that bore the burnt orange hue of a Muspelheim native, though far less extreme than the fire giants they had encountered in that realm. He was dressed in simple traveler's garb, though the material seemed unusually resistant to wear. Most strikingly, he carried no visible weapons, projecting an air of scholarly interest rather than threat. "Ah, there you are," the stranger said, offering what appeared to be a genuinely friendly smile. "Please forgive the intrusion. I've been tracking unusual energy patterns across the realms, and was quite surprised when they led me here." He gestured toward Atreus' bow. "I believe that's the source I've been seeking. Fascinating craftsmanship." "Who are you?" Kratos demanded, not lowering his axe but not attacking either, a stance of cautious neutrality that could shift to either peace or violence depending on the answer. "Oh, my apologies. Introductions are certainly in order." The stranger bowed slightly. "I am Cinder's Park, though friends call me Cinder. Scholar of metallurgical techniques and, if you'll pardon my immodesty, one of the few remaining practitioners of traditional Muspelheim crafting approaches." His gaze returned to Atreus' bow with evident fascination, including, it seems, techniques I believed lost entirely to time. "You're from Muspelheim?" Atreus asked, his natural curiosity beginning to overcome caution. "But you're not a giant." "No, indeed." Cinder's Park, or Cinder, smiled again. "My people were once quite numerous in the less extreme regions of the realm, serving often as intermediaries between the giants and other races. We've dwindled in recent centuries, I'm afraid. Those of us who remain tend towards scholarly pursuits." He tilted his head, studying Kratos with sudden recognition. "You're the one they speak of in whispers, the outsider god who walks between realms." Kratos did not confirm or deny this assessment, instead keeping the conversation focused on the stranger's purpose. "You tracked us. Why?" Cinder's expression grew more serious. "As I mentioned, I detected energy patterns consistent with extremely rare forging techniques, specifically the Whisper of Embers method developed by Master Eldred over 3,000 years ago. He gestured toward Atreus's bow. That weapon bears the unmistakable signature of such work, which should be impossible, as the technique died with Eldred and his apprentices during the first Asgardian incursion. We visited an old forge in Muspelheim, Atreus finally offered, his natural honesty winning out over complete secrecy. Someone named Eldred taught us. Cinder's orange-hued features registered shock, then intense interest. Eldred himself? That's remarkable. His physical form was destroyed millennia ago. The scholar paced a small circle, clearly processing this information. Unless the legends of his binding to the forge. His spirit remained, Kratos confirmed reluctantly, bound to the embers. Extraordinary. Cinder's scholarly enthusiasm was evident in every line of his body. The theoretical possibility has been discussed in ancient texts, of course. The profound connection between master crafters and their forges, sometimes creating metaphysical anchors that can preserve consciousness beyond physical death. But confirmed cases are exceedingly rare. He looked at them with newfound respect, and he taught you his methods. Shared the Whisper of Embers technique directly. After careful consideration, Kratos invited the scholar into their home. Though caution remained his natural state, the visitor's genuine interest in crafting knowledge, rather than power, aligned with what they had learned from Eldred. Throughout the evening, Cinderspark shared histories of Muspelheim's crafting traditions that even Mimir found informative, explaining how techniques had developed and subsequently been lost during conflicts with Asgard. Knowledge is always the first casualty of war, the scholar observed sadly. Techniques refined over centuries can be lost in a single generation when masters fall without having fully trained their apprentices. Before departing, late into the night, Cinder reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object wrapped in iridescent cloth. A token of appreciation for sharing your experience with Eldred, he said, presenting it to Atreus. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, multifaceted crystal that glowed with an inner light reminiscent of Muspelheim's ambient illumination. A forge heart crystal, he explained, exceedingly rare even in Muspelheim. When placed near fire, it stabilizes and focuses the heat in ways similar to the ancient forge's design. Not as sophisticated as the full Whisper of Embers technique, but useful for smaller projects. It would allow you to apply some of what you've learned even without access to the original forge. Knowledge shared is knowledge preserved, Cinderspark said as he prepared to leave. In these uncertain times, with Fimbulwinter upon us and Ragnarok approaching, preservation becomes all the more crucial. The days that followed brought the full force of Fimbulwinter upon the land. Bitter cold descended. Snow piled in drifts taller than Atreus, and the forest grew silent as animals sought shelter from the punishing elements. Within their cabin, however, Kratos and Atreus found unexpected warmth in the knowledge they had gained. Using the Forge Heart crystal, they were able to apply Eldred's techniques on a smaller scale. The crystal, placed near their hearth, created a focused zone of heat that allowed for precise metalwork, even without access to a proper forge. They made small improvements to their equipment, reinforcing weak points, refining edges, creating more efficient tools for daily tasks. One particularly harsh evening, when howling winds made the cabin creak and groan against the onslaught, Atreus sat studying the crystal by firelight. As he turned it in his hands, allowing the flames to dance through its facets. "Father," he said suddenly, "I think there's something inside the crystal." Kratos looked up from where he was repairing a leather strap on his armor. Explain. When the light hits it just right, I can see shapes. Like there's something captured in there. Atreus tilted the crystal carefully, watching how the internal patterns shifted. Not random, deliberate. Kratos moved closer, taking the crystal and examining it with experienced eyes. After several moments of careful study, he nodded slowly. Yes, there are formations within, possibly information stored in the crystal's structure. Like a message? Atreus asked, excitement coloring his voice. Perhaps, Kratos replied. The fire giants were known to use crystalline forms for recording knowledge that could withstand extreme conditions. Through careful experimentation with their hearth fire, adjusting its temperature and airflow using principles learned from Eldred, they discovered how to activate the crystal's hidden contents. When the conditions were precisely right, the crystal projected light onto the cabin wall, forming clear images that resolved into a detailed map. Look, Atreus said with growing excitement. That's the Lake of Nine and those mountains to the east. But some of these features look different. This shows Midgard as it was before Jormungand's awakening changed the terrain, Kratos observed, studying the projection intently. His finger traced a specific location where several lines converged within a mountain range. Here, a hidden valley. Within this valley, detailed symbols suggested some form of structure or settlement. The patterns were unmistakably of Muspelheim origin, though adapted to Midgard's environment. Another forge, Atreus wondered aloud. More substantial than that, Mimir suggested from his position where he could observe the projection. Those symbols indicate a permanent settlement, likely a colony of Muspelheim crafters, who established themselves in Midgard during the early ages of realm travel. We should find it, Atreus said immediately, his eyes bright with anticipation. There might be more knowledge there, people who still practice the old techniques. The journey would be difficult, Kratos cautioned, especially in winter conditions. But not impossible, Atreus countered eagerly, and we've faced worse than snow. After days of preparation, gathering supplies, crafting improved cold weather gear using their new techniques, studying the crystal's map to plan the most efficient route, they set out during a brief lull in Fimbulwinter's assault. The journey was indeed challenging, with deep snow hampering their progress and bitter winds testing even Kratos' endurance. 3 days into their travel, they reached the base of the mountain range shown on the map. The valley they sought lay beyond a high ridge, accessible only through a narrow pass that wound between towering peaks. As they ascended, the snow deepened and the air thinned, making each step laborious. Look at that, Atreus called, pointing ahead as they finally crested the ridge that had blocked their view of the valley beyond. What spread before them was not the abandoned ruins they had half expected, but a living community nestled in the sheltered valley. Stone structures with distinctive architectural elements clearly derived from Muspelheim designs formed a compact settlement. Most remarkably, despite the bitter cold that had gripped Midgard, this valley appeared significantly warmer. Steam rose from channels that ran throughout the community, and areas of ground remained clear of snow. They've channeled geothermal heat, Mimir observed. Brought a bit of Muspelheim's warmth to Midgard. Quite ingenious, really. As they descended toward the settlement, their presence was quickly noticed. Figures emerged from buildings, gathering at what appeared to be the main approach. These individuals physically resembled Cinderspark, the same burnt orange skin tone, though with variations in intensity, and similar builds that were tall and lean compared to most Midgard inhabitants, but much smaller than the fire giants of Muspelheim proper. "Travelers," called an elderly figure who stepped forward from the group. "You stand before the sanctuary of Emberhold. Identify yourselves and your purpose." Kratos stopped at a respectful distance, motioning for Atreus to do the same. "We were guided by this," he responded directly. At his nod, Atreus carefully removed the Forge Heart crystal from its protective pouch, holding it where the valley's light caught its facets, causing it to gleam with its characteristic inner fire. The effect on the settlement's defenders was immediate and dramatic. Murmurs spread through their ranks, and several lowered their improvised weapons. The elder who had spoken took several steps forward, eyes fixed on the crystal with evident recognition. "A forge heart of the old making," they said, their voice carrying tones of wonder and suspicion. "How did outsiders come to possess such a treasure?" "It was a gift," Atreus explained earnestly, "from a scholar named Cinderspark. We learned the Whisper of Embers technique in Muspelheim from a spirit called Eldred who still lives in his forge. The crystal showed us a map that led here." This explanation caused even greater reaction among the defenders. The elder raised a hand for silence, among their increasingly vocal companions. "These claims require verification," she announced. "I am Emberkeeper Valna, guardian of this settlement's traditions and histories. You will demonstrate what you have learned, and we shall determine the truth of your words." What followed was a test of their knowledge and skill. Using materials and tools provided in what Valna called the greeting hall, Kratos and Atreus worked together to create a small but perfect clasp in the shape of interlinking crescents, one solid and protective, the other flexible and adaptive. Together they formed a functional piece that could secure a cloak or bag with exceptional strength while allowing easy operation. Their demonstration of the Whisper of Embers technique, particularly the philosophical approach behind it that emphasized harmony over dominance, convinced Valna and the other elders of Emberhold that they had indeed learned from Eldred himself. "For generations, we have preserved our knowledge in isolation," Valna explained once they had been formally welcomed. "Our ancestors fled here during Thor's earliest campaigns against non-Asgardian settlements. They believed our traditions would be safer hidden from Asgard's notice." The Emberkeeper's expression grew thoughtful as she studied Kratos and Atreus. "But with Fimbulwinter upon us and Ragnarok approaching, the time for hiding may be ending. The convergence of signs, your learning from Eldred, the Forge Heart awakening, your arrival at our doors, these suggest a pattern, not mere coincidence." For 3 days they participated in what the settlement called the Ember Festival, a celebration of crafting traditions and community heritage. Kratos and Atreus were welcomed into workshops normally restricted to lifelong community members, shown techniques preserved nowhere else in the Nine Realms, and entrusted with understanding that had remained hidden since before Thor's birth. The settlement used heat channeled from deep underground, a natural connection to Muspelheim's essence that flowed through certain points in Midgard's structure to power their forges and warm their homes. This heat, carefully regulated through systems similar to what they had seen in Eldred's forge, allowed them to practice traditional techniques while remaining hidden in a land that would otherwise be inhospitable to people with fire giant ancestry. "Creation requires balance," one elderly craftsman explained, as he showed Kratos how to join materials thought incompatible, wood and metal bound not through force, but through harmonized properties. Understanding each material's voice, its essential nature, allows them to work together without one dominating the other. These lessons resonated deeply with both father and son. For Atreus, they provided new dimensions to his growing understanding of the interconnected nature of the realms. For Kratos, they offered perspectives on power that contrasted sharply with everything the gods of Olympus had taught him. power as harmony rather than dominance, strength through connection rather than isolation. On their final night in Emberhold, as a ceremonial fire burned in the community's central gathering space, Valna presented them with gifts. Specialized tools crafted by the settlement's finest artisans, designed to allow them to continue practicing what they had learned even after returning to their home. "You came seeking knowledge and found community," the Emberkeeper said. "Now you return to your own path, carrying both. Use what you have learned wisely. Share it with those who will understand its true value. Knowledge is like fire," she continued, gesturing toward the ceremonial flames. "It can warm or burn, create or destroy, depending on how it is directed and who directs it. The wisdom to make that distinction is perhaps the most valuable knowledge of all." The journey back to their cabin was physically challenging but spiritually lightened by what they had gained. They carried not just new tools and techniques, but deeper understanding of fire's dual nature, of creation's patient power, of traditions that had survived through adaptation rather than rigidity. When they finally reached their home, finding it undisturbed beneath thick drifts of snow, they set immediately to applying what they had learned. The Forge Heart crystal, now better understood through Emberhold's teachings, allowed them to transform their hearth into a more sophisticated heat source, one that warmed their dwelling more efficiently, while also providing the precise conditions needed for their newfound crafting skills. "It's strange," Atires commented one evening as they worked together on improving their hunting tools. "We went looking for a way to make my bow stronger, but we found so much more. Often the journey reveals its purpose only after we have walked it," Kratos replied, surprising his son with this unusually philosophical response. As Fimbulwinter's grip tightened further on the land, their enhanced skills proved increasingly valuable. They created more efficient methods for preserving food, improved their dwelling's resistance to cold, and refined their weapons not just for greater killing power, but for precision and balance that required less effort to wield effectively. More significant than these practical applications was the subtle shift in perspective that accompanied them. Kratos, who had spent centuries as the embodiment of destruction, found unexpected satisfaction in these acts of creation. The patience required, the focus on harmony rather than dominance, offered a counterbalance to the rage that had defined so much of his existence. For Atreus, the knowledge gained provided new dimensions to his understanding of his mixed heritage. The fire giants, so often depicted solely as agents of destruction in Norse mythology, had once been master creators whose works were valued throughout the realms. This complexity offered parallels to his own developing identity. Neither simply Greek nor Norse, neither mortal nor god, but something unique that contained elements of each while transcending their limitation. One night, as Fimbulwinter's storms howled outside and they sat by their improved hearth, Mimir broke a comfortable silence with a thoughtful observation. "You know, brothers, this journey has been rather different from our usual adventures. No gods trying to kill you, no ancient curses unleashed, not even a moderately disgruntled troll. Just knowledge, sought, found, and now applied. A welcome change," Kratos acknowledged. "And yet," Mimir continued, "perhaps more significant in its way, the Whisper of Ember's technique was thought lost forever, and now it lives again through you two. Emberhold's isolated community has new connections to the wider world, patterns shifting subtly but meaningfully." Atreus looked up from the arrowheads he was crafting using methods learned in Emberhold. "Do you think it matters? With Ragnarok coming, with everything that's supposed to be destroyed, all the more reason why what you've learned matters," Mimir replied. "Creation in the face of destruction, preservation against oblivion. These small acts of making might seem insignificant against the prophecies of ending, but they represent exactly what survives beyond such endings: knowledge, technique, understanding passed from hand to hand, mind to mind. Kratos, who had been quietly working on reinforcing their dwelling's door hinges, paused in his task. "The cycle of destruction can be broken," he said with the certainty of one who had done precisely that in another realm, another life. "What is written is not always what must be." In the hearth, embers glowed with patient heat, neither extinguished nor consuming, but persistent, balanced, alive with potential, waiting to be awakened by understanding hands into constructive flame. Outside, Fimbulwinter's fury continued unabated, a constant reminder of prophecies unfolding and endings approaching. But within, father and son continued their work of creation. Each object made an implicit rejection of inevitability. Each technique preserved a quiet defiance of oblivion. The bow that had started their journey hung nearby, its strengthened form now just one manifestation of the knowledge they had gained. More important was what couldn't be seen, the understanding that fire could create as well as destroy, that strength could come through harmony rather than dominance, that the most enduring power often whispered rather than roared. Like the embers that had given the technique its name, these realizations glowed steadily in both father and son, waiting for the right moment, the right purpose, to be fanned into transformative flame. As the embers faded and Atreus drifted towards sleep, the tale of the ancient forge settled into memory, a story of creation amidst destruction, of knowledge preserved against time's relentless passage. Yet the journey of Kratos and Atreus continues through the realms, each adventure revealing new wonders and challenges that shape their path together. Now close your eyes and let your mind follow father and son as they venture deeper into Midgard's mysteries. For as winter's grip begins to loosen and the first whispers of spring touch the land, they will discover something ancient stirring beneath the earth. A place where sulfur springs carry melodies from the beginning of time, where caves breathe with voices both beautiful and haunting. Our next tale awaits in the depths below, where darkness and light dance together, and the very rock sings secrets to those patient enough to listen. The forest had grown quiet as winter's grip began to loosen its hold on Midgard. Snow still blanketed the ground in patches, but the crushing weight of Fimbulwinter had eased enough that new sounds could be heard in the woods. The drip of melting ice, the cautious return of birdsong, the creak of trees straightening after months bent beneath snow and ice. Kratos moved through this transitional landscape with his customary vigilance, axe within reach, senses alert to any threat that might emerge from the shadowed trees. Behind him, Atreus followed with the quiet confidence of a boy becoming a young man, his enhanced bow slung across his back, blue eyes scanning their surroundings with a hunter's precision. "Father," Atreus said, breaking the companionable silence between them. "Do you hear that?" Kratos paused, his head tilting slightly as he focused his senses. Beneath the normal sounds of the forest, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant rush of a stream freed from winter ice, came something else. A faint, melodic humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Yes," he acknowledged, "from below. It sounds like singing," Atreus observed, his voice tinged with wonder. "But not like any voice I've heard before." From the bag at Kratos' belt came a familiar voice. "Ah, we must be nearing the Vetrilafjord range," announced Mimir, the severed head of the self-proclaimed wisest man alive. If I've got my bearings right, these hills hide the entrance to what locals once called the Singing Caves. Singing Caves, Atreus repeated, already moving in the direction of the sound with a natural curiosity that both exasperated and secretly pleased his father. Indeed, lad, a network of caverns formed long ago when magma from Muspelheim pushed upward, but never quite broke through Midgard's surface. Left behind a remarkable system of tunnels and chambers, heated by sulfur vents that produce the most peculiar tones when air passes through them. Kratos followed his son's path, listening as the strange melody grew more distinct. It did not sound threatening, but experience had taught him that beauty often concealed danger in the realms they traveled. "Is it safe?" he asked Mimir directly, keeping his voice low enough that Atreus, now eagerly scrambling up a rocky incline ahead of them, would not hear the concern in his question. "Relatively speaking," Mimir replied quietly. "The caves themselves aren't sentient or malicious, but they're unstable in places. Geothermal activity can cause tremors, cave-ins, need to tread carefully, but..." The severed head paused, seeming to choose his next words with care. "There's also talk of healing properties in the deepest springs. Waters said to ease not just physical wounds, but deeper hurts as well." Kratos made a non-committal sound in response, but his eyes tracked his son with heightened attention. The boy had been pushing himself hard these past months, taking on responsibilities beyond his years as they navigated the increasingly complex challenges of their journey. Perhaps a brief respite would serve them both. "Father, I think I found the entrance," Atreus called from atop the rocky rise. Joining his son, Kratos saw what appeared to be a narrow fissure in the hillside, barely wide enough for an adult to pass through sideways. Warm air flowed from the opening, carrying the melodic humming that had first caught their attention. The stone around the entrance was smooth, as if polished by centuries of emerging steam. "It's beautiful," Atreus said, leaning closer to the opening, like voices singing in a language I almost understand. Kratos studied the entrance with more practical concerns in mind. "It is narrow. We would be vulnerable if something attacked while we were inside." "Actually," Mimir interjected, "that's part of why these caves remained relatively undisturbed through the ages. Few creatures, even the most desperate, choose to enter such confined spaces. The atmosphere inside, the sulfur content, the heat, it's uncomfortable for most beings that call Midgard home." Atreus looked to his father with barely concealed eagerness. "Can we explore it? Just for a little while?" Kratos considered their situation. They had no pressing objective that demanded immediate attention. Their supplies were adequate. And there was something in his son's expression, a simple desire for wonder rather than necessity, that he found himself reluctant to deny. Briefly, he conceded, "But we stay together. The first sign of danger, we leave." Atreus' face brightened with a smile. "Of course. I'll be careful, I promise." "I'll go first," Kratos decided, eyeing the narrow entrance. "Wait until I call before following." Turning sideways, Kratos eased himself into the fissure. The warmth intensified immediately, not unpleasant, but noticeable after the cool forest air. The stone walls pressed close on either side, forcing him to move with careful precision. After several yards of measured progress, the passage widened abruptly, opening into a chamber large enough that he could stand upright with room to spare. "You can come through now," he called back to Atreus. "Move slowly." As his son navigated the narrow entrance, Kratos surveyed their surroundings. The chamber glowed with soft ambient light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Veins of crystalline material ran through the dark stone, pulsing with a gentle luminescence in shades of amber and pale blue. The air was warm and carried a distinct mineral scent, not unpleasant but foreign, speaking of deep earth and ancient processes. Wow, Atreus breathed as he entered the chamber, his voice hushed as if in a sacred space. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. The singing was clearer now, coming from multiple directions deeper within the cave system. It rose and fell in patterns that almost suggested conversation, different tones responding to each other across unseen distances, creating harmonies that shifted and evolved with hypnotic unpredictability. "What makes the sounds?" Atreus asked, turning slowly to take in the entirety of the chamber. "Sulfur vents," Mimir explained as Kratos unhooked the head from his belt, allowing him a better view of their surroundings. When hot air from Muspelheim's depths passes through openings of particular shapes and sizes, it creates tones, like a giant, natural flute carved by millennia of geothermal activity. Each vent has its own voice, so to speak. The locals who once ventured here believed the caves were singing the memories of the earth itself. As if in response to Mimir's explanation, a new tone joined the subterranean chorus, a lower, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The crystals in the walls pulsed more intensely with each wave of sound. "The passages ahead will lead us deeper," Mimir continued. "If memory serves, there should be a series of increasingly large chambers, culminating in a central cavern with a thermal spring at its heart." "A hot spring?" Atreus perked up even further at this information. "Like a bath?" "Far more than that, lad. The waters are said to have remarkable properties, soothing to body and mind alike. Warriors once sought these springs after particularly harrowing battles, not just for physical recovery, but to ease the weight of their deeds." Kratos, who had been examining the various passages leading from the chamber, turned at these words. His expression remained stoic, but there was a subtle shift in his posture that Atreus had learned to recognize. A momentary lowering of his guard, a hint of consideration. "We could go a little further?" Atreus suggested, careful not to push too hard against his father's cautious nature. "Just to see this spring?" After a moment's consideration, Kratos nodded. "We proceed carefully. These formations appear stable, but Mimir warns of possible tremors." They chose the widest of the passages leading from the entry chamber, following a gradually descending path deeper into the earth. The singing grew more complex as they advanced, layered tones weaving together in patterns that occasionally seemed to form words almost at the edge of comprehension. The crystalline veins in the walls thickened, their glow providing sufficient light to navigate without needing to create fire. The passage opened into a second chamber, larger than the first and dominated by a formation of stone columns that rose from floor to ceiling. Each column was ridged with horizontal striations, as if marking the passage of centuries. Between these natural pillars, small vents in the floor released gentle plumes of steam that added their own soft whistling to the cave's song. "Father, look," Atreus said softly, pointing to a shadowed alcove near one of the columns. A small flickering light hovered there, no larger than a candle flame, but moving with deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random burning. As they watched, the light drifted from its hiding place, bobbing in what almost seemed a greeting, before retreating further into the chamber. "A fire sprite," Mimir identified with evident delight. "Quite rare in Midgard these days. They're typically found much closer to Muspelheim's borders." "Is it dangerous?" Kratos asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his axe. "Not this variety, no. More curious than threatening. In fact, they can be helpful guides in unstable terrain. They're remarkably sensitive to changes in air currents that might signal an impending collapse." As if understanding Mimir's explanation, the sprite bobbed again and drifted toward one of the passages leading deeper into the cave system. It paused, flaring briefly brighter, then continued on its way. "I think it wants us to follow," Atreus said, already moving in the sprite's direction. "Carefully," Kratos reminded him, though he too began to follow the bobbing light. "It may not intend harm, but we know nothing of its purpose." The sprite led them through the pillared chamber and into a narrower corridor where the singing grew more intense. Here, the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with certain tones, creating a sensation of being inside an enormous musical instrument. The temperature continued to rise, though not uncomfortably so, a gentle warmth that worked its way into tired muscles and old injuries with subtle persistence. Atreus moved with increasing wonder, occasionally reaching out to touch the vibrating walls, feeling the music through his fingertips. "It's like they're telling a story," he said. "I can almost understand it." "The boy may not be far wrong," Mimir commented. "The oldest accounts suggest these caves formed during the same cataclysm that first separated the realms. What you're hearing could well be echoes of that primordial event, the memory of worlds being born, preserved in stone and air." They followed the sprite through a series of smaller chambers, each with its own unique acoustic properties and crystalline formations. In one, stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen tears, each dripping water in a rhythm that perfectly complemented the singing vents. In another, a shallow pool reflected the glowing crystals above, doubling their light and creating the illusion of endless depth. Throughout their journey deeper into the cave system, Kratos maintained his vigilance, but even he could not remain entirely unmoved by the surroundings. There was something in the harmonic tones that seemed to bypass his usual defenses, resonating with something long buried within him. Not memory exactly, but sensation, like recognizing a scent from earliest childhood, impossible to name but viscerally familiar. The fire sprite led them finally to a threshold that seemed to mark a significant transition. The passage widened suddenly, and ahead they could see a much larger space, illuminated by a different quality of light. Warmer, more diffuse, suggesting open water, reflecting crystalline glow. "I believe we've reached the central chamber," Mimir said, his voice hushed with anticipation. The heart of the singing caves. They emerged onto a natural stone ledge overlooking a vast cavern. Below them stretched a pool of water, steaming gently in the cool air, its surface perfectly still, except where occasional bubbles rose from unseen depths. The walls soared upward to a ceiling lost in shadow, while crystalline formations more elaborate than any they had yet seen created a landscape of light and color around the pool's edges. But most remarkable was the sound. Here, in this central space, the singing reached its full complexity. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of tones merging and separating in patterns that seemed both random and perfectly ordered. The effect was mesmerizing, a composition that had continued uninterrupted for millennia, heard by few and understood by none. "It's incredible," Atrian whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentlest tones of the cave's song. "I've never felt anything like this before." The fire sprite that had guided them bobbed at the edge of the ledge, then drifted downward, tracing a path along the cavern wall that appeared to lead to the pool's edge. Looking more closely, Kratos could see natural steps formed in the rock, wide enough to navigate safely if one moved with care. "The springs," Mimir said with quiet reverence, "heated directly by Muspelheim's distant fires, filtered through layers of earth that infused the waters with minerals found nowhere else in the realms. Those who found their way here in ages past spoke of emerging renewed, unburdened." Kratos studied the descent path with his typical practical assessment. The steps appear stable, but be cautious. The stone may be slick with condensation. They made their way down to the pool's edge, the singing growing ever more enveloping as they descended. The fire sprite accompanied them, its light providing additional illumination for particularly shadowed sections of the path. When they finally reached the bottom, they found themselves standing on a smooth stone shore beside waters of impossible clarity. Despite its depth, which appeared considerable, they could see all the way to the bottom, where more crystals glowed like submerged stars. "Can we?" Atreus began, looking to his father with hopeful question. Kratos considered for a moment, then nodded. "Test the temperature first." Gradually, kneeling at the pool's edge, Atreus dipped his fingers into the water. "It's warm, but not too hot. Perfect, actually." He looked up with undisguised eagerness. "Can we stay for a while? Please?" Something in his son's simple request, the boyish excitement that sometimes got lost beneath the weight of their journey's purpose, shifted something in Kratos' usual resolute focus. "Yes," he agreed. "A brief rest would be acceptable." The relief and happiness that crossed Atreus' face made it clear how much he had needed this moment of respite, this permission to simply experience wonder without immediate purpose or pressing threat. Finding a natural alcove that offered some privacy, they removed their armor and weapons. Though Kratos positioned his axe within immediate reach, eternal vigilance not entirely abandoned even here. The fire sprite kept a respectful distance, drifting to hover near a cluster of particularly resonant crystals, where it seemed to pulse in rhythm with their tones. Entering the pool was like sinking into liquid comfort. The water enveloped them with perfect warmth, not the intense heat of a warrior's restorative bath, but something gentler, more subtle in its effects. Kratos felt ancient tensions in his muscles begin to release, layers of readiness that he had maintained for so long they had become part of his physical identity. Atreus moved further into the pool, ducking beneath the surface momentarily before re-emerging with an expression of pure delight. "It feels like it's washing away more than just dirt," he said, finding a submerged ledge where he could sit with the water reaching his shoulders. "Like it's cleaning things inside, too." Kratos made a non-committal sound, but he could not deny the truth in his son's observation. The water seemed to work its way beneath his skin, seeking out not just physical tensions, but the deeper strains of memory and regret that he carried always. Not erasing them, nothing could do that, but somehow making them less jagged, less immediately painful to touch in thought. Mimir, positioned safely at the pool's edge, where he could observe without risk to the magical bindings that preserved his consciousness, sighed with evident contentment. There's a reason these waters were sought by those who knew of them, not just healing in the ordinary sense, but a kind of realignment, bringing one back to oneself. "The singing helps," Atreus noted, closing his eyes to focus on the cave's harmonics. "It's like it's speaking directly to something inside me, not with words but with feeling." They rested in the pool's embrace, the minutes stretching into a measureless interval where time seemed less relevant than the sensations of warmth, weightlessness, and the ever-changing song that surrounded them. The fire sprite drifted occasionally from crystal to crystal, its glow intensifying or dimming in apparent response to particular tones in the cave's composition. After what might have been an hour, perhaps longer, Atreus broke the comfortable silence between them. "Father," he began, his voice carrying a note of careful consideration, "does it make you think of home? The heat, I mean. Of where you came from before?" Kratos opened his eyes, studying his son's face, the genuine curiosity there, free of judgment or demand. It was the sort of question he would once have deflected or ignored entirely, maintaining the walls he had built around his past. But their journey together had changed him, incrementally but undeniably. "No," he answered finally. Sparta's heat was harsh, punishing. "This is different." Encouraged by his father's response, Atreus continued. "Adapting was necessary," Kratos said simply, "for survival. But it must have been hard," Adrian persisted gently. "Even for you." Kratos was silent for a long moment, the cave's singing filling the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality Atreus rarely heard, a softness that suggested memory rather than instruction. The cold was challenging at first, not just the physical discomfort, but what it represented. Distance, isolation. He looked down at the water swirling around him. "Your mother understood this. She would build the fire higher on the darkest nights of winter, not because I needed the warmth, but because she knew the flames reminded me of something familiar." Atreus absorbed this rare glimpse into his parents' life before his birth. She was kind that way, always knowing what people needed, even when they didn't say it. "Yes," Kratos agreed, the single word carrying volumes of unspoken feeling. They fell silent again, but it was a different quality of silence now. Not the careful distance Kratos typically maintained, but something more shared, a quiet that connected rather than separated. After some time, Atreus spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I used to think I wanted to know about all your great battles and victories, the god-killing and all that." He traced patterns in the water's surface with his fingertips. "But now I think I'd rather know about the other things, the hard parts, the fears even." He looked up, meeting his father's gaze directly. "Not because I want to see weakness, but because I want to understand." Kratos held his son's gaze, something shifting in his own expression, a subtle relaxation of the stern mask he habitually wore. Here, in this singing chamber deep beneath the earth, surrounded by warmth and ancient harmonies, his usual defenses seemed less necessary, less absolute. "Understanding comes with time," he said finally, "and some burdens are not meant for you to carry." "I know," Atreus acknowledged, "but sharing them doesn't always mean I have to carry them too. Sometimes it just means walking beside you while you do." The wisdom in his son's words, a wisdom beyond his years, reminiscent of Faye's perspective, caught Kratos unprepared. Before he could formulate a response, a new sound intruded on the cave's harmonies. A low rumbling that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. "Tremor," Kratos identified immediately, rising from the water with combat-honed reflexes. "We should leave." The fire sprite, which had been drifting peacefully among the crystals, suddenly darted toward one of the passages leading from the central chamber. It flared brightly, moving in agitated patterns that clearly communicated urgency. "I think it's warning us," Atreus said, quickly making his way out of the pool to gather his clothing and weapons. "That passage might be dangerous. Or it might be showing us the safest route," Mimir suggested as Kratos retrieved him from the pool's edge. "These sprites can sense shifts in air pressure that precede cave-ins. It could be trying to guide us away from unstable areas." The rumbling intensified briefly, then subsided, leaving an altered quality to the cave's singing. Certain tones now carried a strained vibration, like an instrument slightly out of tune. Small fragments of stone dislodged from the ceiling, falling into the pool with tiny splashes. "We must move quickly but carefully," Kratos instructed, securing his armor with practiced efficiency. "Follow the sprite if it appears to be leading away from danger, but stay close to me." Fully dressed and armed once more, they began making their way back up the stone steps to the ledge overlooking the central chamber. The fire sprite darted ahead, illuminating the path and occasionally pausing, as if to ensure they were following. Another tremor shook the cavern just as they reached the top of the steps. This one lasted longer, causing more substantial debris to fall from the ceiling. One particularly large chunk of stone crashed into the pool below, sending waves across the previously calm surface. "The passages are likely to be less stable than this main chamber," Mimir warned. "We'll need to move swiftly through the narrower sections." Following the sprite's guidance, they entered a passage different from the one they had used to reach the central chamber. This one was narrower, requiring them to proceed in single file, with more pronounced curves that limited visibility ahead. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Atreus asked, having to raise his voice slightly as the singing of the caves had grown more intense, almost agitated in its patterns. "The sprite seems certain," Mimir replied, "and given the increasing frequency of the tremors, a more direct route to the surface would be prudent, even if it's somewhat more challenging." As they navigated the winding passage, the crystalline formations became more dense, their glow fluctuating with each tremor that passed through the cave system. The air grew warmer, suggesting they were passing closer to the geothermal vents that heated the entire network. Atreus, moving behind his father in the narrow space, found his curiosity momentarily overcoming his concern about the unstable conditions. "The crystals are changing color," he observed, noting how the primarily amber and blue hues had shifted toward deeper reds and violets. "Responding to pressure changes," Mimir explained. "These formations are sensitive to the Earth's movements. In a way, they're showing us the cave's distress." Another, stronger tremor shook the passage, this one dislodging a section of the ceiling just ahead of them. Kratos reacted instantly, pulling Atreus back and shielding him as stone fragments scattered around them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice carrying a rarely heard note of concern. "I'm fine," Atreus assured him, "but the path is blocked." Indeed, the passage ahead was now filled with rubble, impossible to traverse without significant effort that would likely trigger further collapse. The fire sprite, which had avoided the falling debris with nimble movements, now hovered near a small opening in the wall of the passage, a fissure barely visible in the crystalline glow. "I think it wants us to go that way," Atreus said, pointing to the sprite's position. Kratos examined the opening with justifiable skepticism. "It is very narrow, but not impassable," Mimir observed. "Not for those of your particular talents, at any rate. And if the sprite is suggesting it, there's good reason to believe it leads to safety." Another tremor, milder but serving as reminder of their precarious situation, decided the matter. Kratos approached the fissure, examining it closely before turning to Atreus. "I will go first. If it becomes too narrow, we find another way. The opening proved challenging but navigable, requiring them to turn sideways and occasionally remove pieces of equipment to squeeze through particularly tight sections. The fire sprite guided them patiently, its light providing crucial illumination in the confined space where the crystal formations were sparse. "The singing is different here," Atreus noted as they worked their way through the fissure. "More like whispering." He was right. The dominant harmonics of the main chambers had given way to softer, more subtle tones that seemed to flow around them like gentle currents in water. There was an intimacy to these sounds, as if they were being admitted to secrets not meant for casual visitors. After what felt like an eternity of careful navigation through the narrow space, the fissure widened abruptly, opening into a small chamber unlike any they had yet seen in the cave system. Here, the crystals grew in perfect spirals from floor to ceiling, creating formations that resembled frozen waterfalls. The light they emitted was softer, more muted, casting everything in a gentle blue glow. At the chamber's center stood a single column of stone, different from the surrounding rock, darker, almost metallic in appearance. Its surface was covered in fine etchings that caught the light in ways that made them seem to move, to shift beneath the eye's focus. "By all the branches of Yggdrasil," Mimir breathed in evident wonder. "A resonance pillar. I've read accounts, but never thought to see one with my own eyes. Or what's left of them, at any rate." "What is it?" Atreus asked, approaching the column with natural curiosity, but heeding his father's cautioning gesture to move slowly. "A record of sorts, created during the earliest days after the realm's separation. The beings who crafted these pillars, neither giant nor god nor anything we have simple names for, used them to preserve knowledge they feared might otherwise be lost. The fire sprite circled the pillar in what appeared to be a gesture of respect or perhaps reverence, its light dimming to match the subtle illumination of the chamber. The whispering tones seemed to emanate directly from the column itself, as if the stone were breathing secrets into the still air. "How do we read it?" Atreus wondered, studying the intricate etchings that covered the pillar's surface. They resembled no writing system he had encountered in his studies of languages, appearing more like musical notation or perhaps the patterning of stars. "Not through sight alone," Mimir explained. "These pillars speak to multiple senses simultaneously. Touch was typically part of the experience, though I would advise caution given our current circumstances." Kratos, who had been assessing the chamber for any signs of instability during the ongoing tremors, turned his attention to the pillar. "Is it dangerous?" "Not inherently, no. It's a repository of knowledge, not a weapon or trap. But knowledge itself can sometimes be transformative." Despite his father's protective instincts, which were clearly evident in his posture, Atreus felt drawn to the pillar with an intensity he couldn't easily explain. I think it wants to be understood," he said softly, "like it's been waiting." The fire sprite, having completed its circuit of the pillar, now hovered near Atreus, its light pulsing in a rhythm that matched the whispering tones. Then, with deliberate movement, it drifted to a specific section of the etchings and flared briefly brighter. Taking this as guidance, Atreus cautiously raised his hand toward the indicated area. He glanced at his father, seeking permission or at least acceptance of his intent. After a moment of consideration, Kratos gave a slight nod, though he moved closer to his son, ready to intervene if necessary. "Carefully," he advised, "and be prepared to withdraw immediately if anything feels wrong." With gentle fingertips, Atreus touched the etched surface of the pillar. The sensation was unexpected. Not cold stone as the appearance suggested, but something warm and almost yielding, like flesh with a heartbeat beneath. The whispering tones intensified, focusing around him in a cocoon of sound that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, speaking directly to something deeper. "Oh," he breathed, his eyes widening as understanding flowed into him, not as words or images, but as direct knowing, concepts unfolding in his mind with organic naturalness. "It's telling me about the caves, about how they were formed and why they sing." Kratos watched his son closely, alert for any sign of distress, but seeing only wonder and intense focus in the boy's expression. "The caves are alive, in a way," Atreus continued, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality that echoed the whispering tones. "Not conscious like we are, but aware. They remember the time before the realms were separated, when everything was one. The singing is that memory, trying to maintain the connection that was broken." The fire sprite circled Atreus slowly as he communed with the pillar, its light flickering in patterns that seemed to respond to, or perhaps enhance, the information being transferred. The tremors that had been shaking the cave system grew more subdued, as if the earth itself were pausing to listen. "The sprites are guardians," Atreus went on, his free hand reaching out as if to touch something visible only to him. "They tend the memory, keep the song from fading. They're not from Muspelheim originally. They're fragments of the original fire that existed before the realms were distinct." He fell silent for a moment, his expression shifting to something more solemn, more weighted. "There's more, but it's hard to understand. Something about cycles ending and beginning again. About songs ending and new ones starting." Gradually, Atreus withdrew his hand from the pillar, the connection fading gently rather than breaking abruptly. He looked slightly dazed, as if returning from a great distance. "Are you well?" Kratos asked immediately, his hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him in the present moment. "Yes," Atreus assured him, blinking as he readjusted to normal perception. "It was beautiful. Sad, too, but mostly beautiful. Like hearing a story that explains things you've always wondered about, but never knew how to ask." The fire sprite, seemingly satisfied with what had transpired, now drifted toward another opening in the chamber's wall, one they hadn't noticed upon entering, partially concealed behind crystalline formations. Its movements suggested urgency renewed, reminding them that despite the relative calm of this sanctuary, the cave system remained unstable. "I believe our guide is indicating the way forward," Mimir observed, "and given the pillar's apparent significance, it's likely this chamber is protected against minor instabilities. The path beyond might not enjoy such security." They followed the sprite through the new opening, which proved to be the beginning of a passage that sloped distinctly upward, a promising sign that it might lead to the surface. The tremors returned as they left the chamber of the resonance pillar, though less violently than before, more like the settling of disturbed earth, returning to balance. The singing of the caves changed quality again in this ascending passage, the intimate whispering giving way to something more expansive, more celebratory in its harmonics. The crystals grew less densely here, but with greater individual size, creating dramatic formations that caught and amplified the cave's song in unexpected ways. "It's like it's saying goodbye," Atreus commented as they climbed steadily upward. "Or maybe, until we meet again, would be more accurate." "You understood much from the pillar," Kratos noted, his tone carrying subtle question beneath the statement. "Not everything," Atreus admitted. "A lot of it was impressions, feelings, rather than clear information, but I understood that the caves aren't just natural formations. They're like echoes of something that existed before, something whole that was broken apart. The cataclysm that separated the realms, Mimir suggested. The pillar was showing you history from before recorded time, knowledge preserved by beings who witnessed the breaking of what was once unified. They continued upward, the passage occasionally narrowing, then widening again, but generally becoming more accessible as they climbed. The air grew cooler, suggesting proximity to the surface, though still carried the mineral scent and gentle warmth that characterized the entire cave system. Finally, after what seemed like hours of careful ascent, they saw natural light ahead. The cool blue of evening sky visible through an opening much wider and more accessible than the fissure through which they had entered the caves. Almost there, Atterus said with evident relief. Though he had found wonder in their underground journey, the prospect of open sky and fresh air held undeniable appeal after the confined spaces and increasingly unstable conditions below. The fire sprite led them to the threshold of the exit, then paused, hovering just inside the boundary between the cave system and the outside world. Its light dimmed and brightened in what seemed like hesitation, or perhaps farewell. "Thank you," Atreus said to the sprite with simple sincerity, "for guiding us, for showing us the pillar." The tiny being flared briefly brighter, as if acknowledging his gratitude, then drifted backward into the depths of the passage, diminishing until it was just a distant point of light before disappearing entirely. They emerged into early evening on a hillside some considerable distance from where they had entered the cave system. The sky above was clear, stars just beginning to appear as the last light of day faded in the west. The air felt almost shockingly crisp after the mineral warmth below, carrying the scents of pine and melting snow that marked this transition between winter and spring. "A different exit," Kratos observed, quickly orienting himself to their new location. "We have traveled further than it seemed." Atreus inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the forest air that felt both familiar and somehow changed after their time in the caves. "I feel different," he said, trying to articulate the subtle shift in his perception. "Like the singing is still inside me somehow." "The waters of the deep springs often leave their mark," Mimir commented. "Not visibly, but in ways that unfold gradually. Many who sought healing there spoke of continuing to feel its effects long after they departed." Kratos surveyed the surrounding terrain with practiced attention, identifying landmarks that would guide them home. The fading light suggested they had spent longer beneath the earth than he had intended, but he felt no regret for the detour. It had served purposes beyond mere rest, purposes he might not have recognized as necessary before their descent. "We should make camp," he decided, noting a suitable location nearby where a fallen tree provided natural shelter against the lingering winter winds. "Return home with daylight." As they prepared their simple camp, gathering wood for a fire and setting out bedrolls, Atreus remained unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful rather than tired. The boy who normally filled silence with questions or observations seemed content to remain with his own thoughts, occasionally tilting his head slightly as if listening to something just beyond hearing. When their preparations were complete and they sat beside the small fire Kratos had built, Atreus finally spoke. "Father," he began, his voice carrying the careful consideration that had become more frequent as he matured. "What the pillar showed me about the caves, about them remembering when things were whole before they were broken apart. Do you think that's why the waters felt healing? Because they remember when there wasn't separation?" Kratos considered the question with appropriate seriousness. In the past, he might have dismissed such philosophical musings as impractical, irrelevant to survival, but their journey together had taught him the value of his son's perspective, his ability to see connections that Kratos' more battle-focused mind might overlook. Perhaps, he acknowledged, wholeness has power, as does its memory. Triss nodded, satisfied with this response. I keep thinking about what you said in the pool, about Mother understanding what you needed, even when you didn't say it. He poked at the fire with a small stick, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. I think that's another kind of wholeness, when someone knows you so well that the separation between you becomes less. Mimir, positioned on a log where he could participate in their fireside conversation, made a soft sound of appreciation. Wisdom beyond your years, lad. The boundaries between beings are both necessary and, at times, transcended. It's a paradox that few understand so young. Kratos studied his son across the fire, seeing both the boy he had been and the young man he was becoming. Thoughtful, perceptive, carrying his mother's insight and something of his father's strength, yet entirely his own person. Another kind of wholeness, perhaps, not the erasure of distinction but the integration of different influences into something unique and complete in itself. Your mother would be proud, he said simply, of who you are becoming. The words were few, as was his way, but their impact was visible in Atreus' expression, surprise followed by a deep, quiet happiness that needed no elaborate response. They sat in companionable silence as full night settled around them, each listening in their own way to the subtle echoes of the cave's song that seemed to have followed them to the surface. Later, as Atreus drifted towards sleep, wrapped in his furs beside the fire, Kratos remained wakeful, his gaze moving between his son's peaceful face and the star-filled sky above. The tensions that normally kept him vigilant, prepared for threat at any moment, felt subtly altered, not absent, for such ingrained readiness could never fully leave him, but somehow less consuming, as if they had found a more balanced place within his awareness. The springs have affected you too, brother, Mimir observed quietly, his voice pitched not to disturb the sleeping boy, though perhaps not in ways immediately apparent. Kratos made a non-committal sound, neither confirmation nor denial. The most profound healing often goes unnoticed at first, Mimir continued, undeterred by the sparse response, like a wound that closes from the deepest layer outward. The surface may appear unchanged, while significant repair happens beneath. Kratos remained silent for a long moment, his gaze now fixed on the dancing flames of their small fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality rarely heard, a reflective tone that suggested thoughts long held private. In Sparta, weakness was not permitted. Pain was to be endured, never eased. To seek comfort was to invite contempt. He adjusted a log in the fire with careful precision. Faye understood this. Conditioning. She never tried to remove the armor I had built, but she found ways to tend what lay beneath without requiring its removal. A remarkable woman, Mimir said simply, to recognize that healing sometimes must work around barriers rather than demanding their dismantling. Yes, Kratos looked toward his sleeping son again. Atreus has this same perception. He sees paths I cannot, because he walks a different road than you did, Mimir suggested. One that has its own challenges, certainly, but not the same unrelenting crucible that forged you. You've ensured that, however harsh your methods might sometimes seem. This observation settled between them, neither requiring agreement nor inviting debate, simply a truth acknowledged. like the stars above or the earth beneath. Kratos continued his vigil through the night, but with a quality of restfulness that belied his wakefulness, as if something within him had found a moment's peace in the song that still whispered at the edges of awareness. Morning arrived with gentle insistence, sunlight filtering through branches, still bare from winter but showing the first tiny buds of approaching spring. Atreus woke refreshed, stretching with the unself-conscious ease of youth before immediately checking his bow and quiver, habits instilled by years of his father's training. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked Kratos, noting the familiar signs of his father's night-long vigilance. "Enough," Kratos replied, already preparing to break camp with efficient movements. "We should reach home by midday if we maintain a steady pace." As they gathered their belongings and extinguished the fire's remaining embers, Atreus paused, looking back in the direction of the cave's exit. "Do you think we'll ever return there?" he asked, a note of wistfulness in his voice. "To the singing caves?" Kratos considered the question with his usual deliberation. "Perhaps. When there is need." "I'd like that," Atreus said simply. It felt like somewhere that understood something important, something I can't quite put into words. They set off toward home, moving through the forest with the natural rhythm they had developed through countless journeys together. The day was clear, warming gradually as the sun climbed higher, melting patches of snow and releasing the sense of earth and green things, preparing to emerge from winter's long dormancy. As they walked, Atreus occasionally hummed fragments of melody that seemed inspired by the cave's songs, though not direct imitations. Kratos made no comment on this, but neither did he discourage it. Another small shift, perhaps unnoticeable to others, but significant between them. When they finally crested the rise that brought their cabin into view, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, straight line against the blue sky, both felt the particular satisfaction of returning home after a journey that had changed them in ways still unfolding, still revealing themselves with each step forward. The singing caves had offered not just rest for their bodies, but a rare opportunity to experience harmony, both the literal harmonics that filled those subterranean chambers, and the more elusive harmony between father and son, between past and present, between what had been broken and what might yet become whole. As they approached their dwelling, Atreus glanced up at his father with a small smile that carried understanding beyond his years. "We brought some of it back with us, didn't we?" he said, the song. Kratos met his son's gaze, allowing a moment of recognition that needed no elaborate confirmation. "Yes," he acknowledged simply, "we did." The cave's music remained with them as they crossed the final distance to their home, not as sound perceptible to ordinary senses, but as something deeper, a resonance carried within. It would continue to work its subtle influence in the days and journeys ahead, a quiet reminder that healing comes in many forms, that what has been separated can still remember wholeness, and that some songs once heard become part of those who listen, changing them note by note, harmony by harmony, in ways that even gods and giants could not fully predict. As the resonance of the singing caves fades gently from your mind, another tale of Kratos and Atreus awaits. The harmonies that followed them home would continue to echo in their memories, but the journey of father and son pauses for no one, not even gods. The seasons turn, and with them come new paths to travel. From the healing waters beneath the earth, our story now shifts to towering monuments that reach toward the sky. From melodic whispers that soothe the soul, we move to silent sentinels that guard forgotten histories. Let your thoughts drift now to a place where ash falls like snow, where ancient pillars stand as testament to memories both honored and feared. a place where Kratos and Atreus will confront not just external challenges, but the weight of remembrance itself. And so our journey through the realms draws to a close for tonight. May Hypnos, god of sleep, watch over you as you drift through dreams of legendary proportions. If these tales of gods and monsters helped guide you to restful sleep, consider supporting our journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to continue sharing these stories night after night. Remember, these videos play uninterrupted through the night, with no ads to disturb your slumber, just the soothing sounds of mythic realms to accompany your dreams. For those seeking passage to exclusive content, our Patreon offers early access to all videos and special playlists crafted to enhance your sleep. The link awaits in the description below. Until our next journey together, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be mighty, and your rest be undisturbed by the conflicts of gods and men. Sleep well, brave one.